Welcome to Cross Connections, Season 2, Cover to Cover, as we read along with you each week and discuss the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Join us as we discover how these stories connect us to God, to our inner selves, and to one another in a world that tries so hard to disconnect us. Welcome back, folks. Here we are. We've finished the Torah, and we are now starting the ancient historical books. We're here for Joshua. But first, it's 1 week into Lent. We're actually recording this today. It's Ash Wednesday as we're recording this.
We're all sitting here ashened.
That's right.
We are all ashed
up.
Well, only Elliot's wearing a cassock.
Yeah.
He's really enjoying it.
I'm loving it. It's like a little dress.
It is.
It's great.
Looks good.
Little
on you,
black
man.
dress.
Looks good on you.
Everybody needs a good little black dress
Basic.
in their
It's
wardrobe.
a basic black dress.
That's right.
It's
Basic black
It's great.
dress.
How's your Lent going, folks?
Yeah, I'm like 3 hours in, so far so good.
Yeah. Trying to still make a decision on how I want to participate in Lent, like if I want to give something up. Or I asked a lot of people this morning giving ashes at the train station what they're giving up.
Oh.
It seems like there's a really big growing movement of addition people, of people that are like, I'm adding something.
Yes.
Taking on.
Which, come on. Be morose. That's what Lent's for.
Well, I'm
Jesus didn't go into the wilderness and say,
Do more.
do more. He said, do less.
I do more.
I'm
That's
a little.
That's
Are
what
you a do more person?
I'm a do more person.
Oh, so
Yeah, I
lame.
tend to be too. I do. So this year I'm fasting for Ash Wednesday and intend to do so for Good Friday. And that's a sunrise to sundown fast.
Wow.
All respect and honor to our, Muslim friends who celebrate Ramadan.
Yeah,
and
which
they
is
fast
30
for
days.
really correlating
a while.
here closely.
Yeah,
It just started, I believe.
Yeah, I believe Ramadan began on Friday.
And they don't even drink water when they fast.
And they
Yeah.
don't even drink water. I'm giving myself water to drink. And our Jewish friends also tend to be fasters.
on the Day of Atonement.
Yeah.
Yom Kippur is a total fast.
Yeah. Whereas I think fasting has fallen out of favor among many Christians.
Western
it seems.
Christians, it has fallen out of favor. Eastern
Yeah.
Christians,
Big
not
fans.
so much. So
Yeah.
I think I've said this before. I retreat at a Coptic Orthodox monastery in the Mojave Desert. The Copts fast 180 days a year.
Wow.
And almost every time I go there,
half the year.
I'm always there for a fast.
Yeah.
Like I've never been there when it hasn't been a fast time.
That explains
So-
how you look so good.
Yep.
Jeez Louise.
Yep, I come back ripped.
Yeah,
So
no kidding.
Goodness.
You're like Joshua.
Joshua. Oh, is that what we're doing today?
Something like that.
Oh, something like that. So, let's
Unfortunately.
see. Maybe we'll bring back fasting. I've done vegetarian Lent before. That's,
Wow.
that's another
like
thing.
like a good Catholic, right? Catholics.
I don't know. I was just trying to be...
They're a
Am I getting
definite
confused?
pescatarian. I mean, they do a lot of fish in Lent.
Right.
Fish Fridays.
Isn't
I love a good fish
isn't
fry. Hit
isn't
me.
it that they don't
Eat meat on Fridays or Wednesdays.
right? And technically, that's actually supposed. Someone told me recently that that's supposed to be year round.
Yeah.
And what happened is, over the course of, I don't know, let's just make up a number, the last 50 years, it became increasingly a Lenten discipline only.
Yeah.
And they would do it the rest of the year. But they were saying, really, all year, you're not supposed to.
Well, as we've learned through the scriptures thus far, it's really easy to fall away from the traditions and the rituals that
Yeah.
you're supposed to follow, right?
And we can have these idealized traditions that maybe don't meet real lived
Yeah.
life practice,
Yeah.
which is actually a good reminder of when you read documents and texts. Like if someone 1,000 years from now is reading about the Catholic Church, they might read, oh, the people didn't eat red meat all Friday, all year long.
Right.
But if you actually lived during the period and saw, it's like, not many people actually did that.
Right.
Which is a good reminder for when we're reading Joshua and
Yeah.
scriptures, that just because it's written in here doesn't mean that's what the people were actually doing.
Well, and also, rumor I've heard is that the reason that they weren't eating meat, but they were allowed to eat fish, was to support the fishmongers. And so there again,
Oh, interesting.
that comes into play of what, politically or whatever,
Yeah.
are they...
What's the contextual?
What's the other contextual stuff going on? And I don't know if that's truth or fiction. Let the Catholics out there correct us.
Yeah.
But I don't know how many are listening to our podcast.
Well, Bill Watson.
Let us know. Let us know. Drop us a note.
Bill Watson listens religiously, so he'll let us know.
Oh,
Excellent.
That's good. All
Good.
right. Right. So
Joshua.
So Joshua.
Joshua.
Joshua. We've entered a new
Fit
book.
the Battle
and
of Jericho.
technically, it worked out that we read the entire book almost in this last week.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. 'Cause
I
it's
think
not
there
a
was
very
only.
long book.
I think that today is the final chapter.
Really? Okay.
Today, not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The
Today
reading
not
plan
being
of-
the day that we're recording,
Yeah,
but
but
today being
releasing.
the day that you're listening.
We actually are. Let me just say up front that so we call him Joshua, but in Hebrew, he is known as Yehoshua. And why does that matter? Well, it matters because there's another important biblical figure whose name originally was also Yehoshua, and that is
Jesus.
Jesus. Yeah, Jesus and Joshua have the same name in Hebrew.
Yeah.
It literally means God saves. And I think about the two having similar function in broad scale in the scriptures. They both are about bringing the people into a promised land. So Joshua brings them into an actual land. Jesus is meant to bring us into the larger kingdom of God. And so they both sort of have like a similar function and the same name.
Right.
Jesus did it with a lot less blood.
Yeah.
Well, or he did it with his own blood.
Oh, there's true. I mean, okay, fair.
He
fair.
didn't devote entire cities and towns and
Right.
whatnot. But
I think that's the version that they were expecting of Jesus.
well, that's
Right.
the version that the people in Jerusalem wanted,
Right. Yeah.
hoped for.
Right. Which we talked about with our recording from the Gospel of Mark. If you go back and listen to it, in the middle of the Gospel of Mark, in Mark chapter 8, Peter says, "You are the Messiah." And his understanding of who the Messiah is completely wrongheaded. Because
Right.
when he says that, and Jesus says, I'm
Gonna suffer
meant
and
to
die.
suffer and die. And Peter's like, no.
kidding me?
And what does Jesus say? Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. One of my favorite scriptures.
Yeah.
But yes, very much an expectation of what a Yeshua or Joshua should be doing, which is conquering promised land.
And because of that, this is Joshua, the book of Joshua, is a troubling book.
Yeah. Right.
This is not. We don't usually do like vacation Bible schools on the book of Joshua, right?
Oh, Jericho.
No, they've got
Jericho's
some-
a classic.
Well, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
we
I
don't
think
really
they did one here on Jericho, a vacation Bible school. There was a Jericho theme.
Joshua fit
Did
the
we like
Bible.
murder all of the?
Jericho. No,
Yeah,
they
we did a
probably
big
just
play at the end, and there was lots of red ribbon.
I think they just circled
walls
something
came a
really,
tumbling
and
down.
The walls came tumbling down, and it wasn't any like they probably don't really think too much about what actually happened when those walls fell.
Right.
It's
no,
just
but,
like,
but you're right.
yay!
This one, Joshua doesn't get talked about too much other than a few stories. And Thomas and I were talking this morning, and we were talking about how boring the end of Joshua is, where
Right.
it's just all of this land allotment.
Yeah.
It's quite dry.
To each of the tribes,
Yeah, to each of the 12 tribes.
Incredible, boring detail.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like from this stump to that well
Totally.
to
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Again, with the real estate.
And true, yeah, the real estate, like really marking out where it is. And in fact, I was reading a commentary on this before we started. This is just nerdy information for anyone that might be interested.
We love the nerdy stuff.
And there's really, even within Joshua and elsewhere in the Pentateuch, different, I guess we could call them views or ideologies of where those markings were, like what designated the true land.
Oh, interesting.
So there's one, I can find the commentary. It's in the notes of the New Oxford Annotated Bible, and there's one that's like, oh, it was to the Euphrates, and that's the true land. And then there's one that's like, no, it was to here, and this is the true land. And they all kind of had a similar
Well,
core,
of course. Like no matter how detailed you get, we're always going to argue about something.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
If you like Bible maps, get yourself a New Oxford Annotated Bible.
Yeah.
They got lots of maps in
Yeah,
here.
lots of maps. And someone the other day was asking for maps.
Yes.
And you know what? My recommendation would be just Google. Make Google your friend, and just if there's a question you have, like Google Joshua Bible maps and just peruse the first couple, hits on Google, and it'll give you a real sense of kind of where these things are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But don't get too lost in the weeds.
Right, because Bible locations are a little bit like Bible math.
Yeah, right.
It's just slightly, some of these are real places that still exist and that
Right.
you will
Yep,
hear
right,
about in
sure.
the news.
Right.
Yeah.
And they are
Like the war's still going on. Like violence then, violence now.
Violence then,
Right.
violence now. I mean, you will read the scriptures, and you will hear about the Golan Hills, and then you will
Yep.
hear about the Golan Hills on the news, and you will hear about Gaza in the Bible, and then you will hear about Gaza
Yep.
in the news, and
Yep.
these are still the same places.
Right.
And some of those really finite boundary lines and things are maybe a little bit more like that Bible math, where you're not quite sure exactly what they're counting and where that comes
Right.
from.
So you,
So-
Rick, wanted to have some comments on this term you introduced in our Deuteronomy episode, the Deuteronomistic history.
Yes.
And Joshua's relationship.
So, as we talked about, I think last time, the Deuteronomistic history is this. It's a bunch of books that are different volumes of one large story. And so it's Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And there's lots of little stories in there, but there's like one narrative that's going from one end to the other. And in the Deuteronomistic history, there is a consistent message. And the message is this: God uses nations to punish wicked nations. So, and we're going to definitely get to this at the end of the Deuteronomistic history when we get to 1st and 2nd Kings, because God will use Assyria, the nation of Assyria, to punish the wicked nation of Israel. 722 BC, Assyria comes in. The northern kingdom of Israel had a bunch of cultic practices that had gone sideways. They're accused of worshiping in the wrong places, worshiping in the wrong ways. There's also some things that they're doing. They're not taking care of the poor. They're not taking care of the widow. And so they've totally fallen off the wagon. And so God uses Assyria to wipe them out. And they do, 722 BC. Then a bit later, God uses the nation of Babylon to destroy the wicked nation of Judah, which had done basically the same things. They had bad cultic practices, they had bad justice practices, and God wipes them out. Here in the early Deuteronomistic history, it's the nations of Canaan. It's the nations who are living in the land that Israel is going to, and God uses Israel to destroy them. Early on in the book of Deuteronomy 9, so this is the beginning of the Deuteronomistic history, 9 verse 5, "It is not because of your faithfulness or because of the uprightness of your mind that you're going in to take possession of their country. It's because of the faithlessness of these nations that Yahweh your God is dispossessing them from before you." And then there's another place in chapter 12, verse 31. "You will not act in this way towards Yahweh your God, because they do for their gods everything that's an offense to Yahweh, that to which he's hostile, because they even burn their sons and daughters in fire for their gods." And so, super troubling book. It sounds like we are not only engaging in genocide, but that God is calling for genocide. And in our modern understanding of how the world works, this just should not be. And the loving God that we sing to in Vacation Bible School just doesn't sound like this. But here we see a consistent message. God uses nations to punish wicked nations. And so we're not just going in and willy-nilly taking out the Canaanites and everyone who's living there, but they're practicing child sacrifice. They're practicing other cultic. And they probably have some justice issues as well. And so God is pronouncing judgment on them.
What I think is interesting is to remember as well, I always think it's funny that this also kind of goes all the way back to Noah. Remember, Canaan was cursed all the way back. Now, Canaan as the son of Ham was cursed all the way back in the beginning of Genesis. We're in Genesis 9, the end of Genesis 9. "Cursed be Canaan, lowest of the slaves shall he be to his brothers." And let Canaan be his slave. This is a little bit like we've been waiting for Canaan. Canaan's been a problem ever since the get-go.
Since the very beginning, right? Literally, the beginning.
And now we're really we're hundreds of years later.
Yeah, I think the other big theme of the Deuteronomistic history to highlight is the centrality of land. This is rooted in even before this history, the promise to Abraham. And then it really takes on a central role in this history that, again, this history is rooted in part of why it's called the Deuteronomistic history, right, Rick, is that these books, Joshua through 2 Kings, the idea is that Deuteronomy was probably written separately, and they're drawing on the theology and ideas of Deuteronomy. And so in Deuteronomy, as we talked about in those 2 episodes, the big idea is this. You talked about nations being used to punish wickedness, and then the core there is that to inherit this land, you have to do X. And if you don't do this, you will not inherit it well, right? So in Deuteronomy 11, we talked about in one of our episodes, there's that famous line where Yahweh says to the people, "See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing if you obey the commandments of God, and the curse if you do not obey the commandments." And so again, it's this very binary X and Y. This will happen, don't do this, and bad things are going to happen. Which, to throw out another big word, you said was ultimately rooted in this ancient Near Eastern idea of the suzerainty treaty. So again, if all of this is new to you, go back, listen to those episodes. But I think what we see in Joshua is the practical unfolding of these ideas as they come into the promised land.
And it's important to note that these ideas never come up again in the Bible. So they're here, but there are other places where it would be really easy. So in the New Testament, Israel is occupied by the Romans.
Yeah.
Romans, they had some interesting cultural things and artistic things and philosophical things going on. But from the position of the Old Testament, they would be a wicked nation. They are practicing wickedness.
Right.
Jesus does not say, all right, guys, we're going to totally devote the Roman Empire. We're going to dismantle it, and we're going to kill everybody. That's no longer the problem.
Let me pause you, because you said we're going to devote the Roman Empire, and some people might be like, what the heck is Rick talking about?
Yes,
because you are literally using the word that's used in Joshua in Deuteronomy, the Hebrew word for destroy, which oddly enough is also devote, harem. And so this is what gets used.
Annihilate.
Really the idea when it's used in this way is to utterly annihilate men, women, children, animals, the whole thing. Like it's almost like you have to fully clear cut the land.
And then they burn and leave it rubble, and no one shall ever, build anything here again.
Exactly.
But as we said at the beginning, I think the beginning of the episode, or was this when we were talking? I can't remember.
When we were talking.
Okay. The people of Jerusalem really would have liked Jesus to have said that.
Yes. Right.
Particularly on Palm Sunday when he comes marching in.
Right.
So
I said this with Peter. Yeah.
Yep.
When I said that on the beginning.
There we go.
Yeah.
You
Peter.
did say, okay.
This is how Peter would have understood Jesus' role as the Messiah.
Yeah.
Right.
Because that's what it was assumed a Messiah would do.
And Jesus is like, no, we're not.
That's not.
I'm Yehoshua, but I'm not that Yehoshua.
Exactly.
We're not doing that again.
Which is this is such a common theme for me, but it is a great way of understanding the elasticity, the progression of the scripture's understanding of God. Like I love to say, a lot of times we talk about the Bible as if it was a single book. And I hate that because it assumes that the Bible speaks with one voice, to use a dollar word, that it's univocal.
Yeah.
And the Bible is not univocal, it's multivocal. And it's polyphonous. Is that the right word?
Yes.
I had an Old Testament professor.
Wait, I'm sorry. Can you define that, please?
Yeah.
Multi-voiced.
Multi-voiced. It's symphonic.
Phone,
it's
I
had an Old Testament professor that talked about it as the Old Testament is not like a solo. It's a symphony.
Yeah.
There are different streams and strands. And a good example to Rick's point about not seeing this again, like Deuteronomy the Deuteronomistic history has a very particular understanding of God's actions and how our actions influence God's actions. But when you read the wisdom literature in the Old Testament, and the wisdom literature is like Job, Ecclesiastes, Psalm somewhat, Proverbs, but Proverbs is actually kind of more Deuteronomistic. But when you read like Ecclesiastes and Job, for example, it is a totally different view.
Sure.
It is very much a view that does not say, the whole point of Job, right, is that you can suffer and it has no relationship to your actions.
And that's, Jesus does this with the Tower of Siloam, where this event happens, the tower falls to the ground and all these people die. And he says, do you think those people sinned worse than anybody else?
Right.
It's like, no, of course not.
Right.
Of course not. This isn't how we do it anymore.
Right. I probably shouldn't bring it up because I can't remember it in exact detail, but he does it as well with one of the stories of one of the blind men. this might be John. I can't remember. I think it's the one where he spits. It's a very weird story. He spits and he uses the dirt.
Yeah.
I think it's that one.
And then
he says, like did this man sin?
Or did his parents sin?
Or did his parents sin? It's a very weird
And Jesus
passage.
is like, neither him nor his parents sinned.
But the point is, like, this is not a 1-to-1 correspondence here, a zero-sum game. Like, this isn't how this works.
The other thing about the violence here is that although it looks total and like everyone's being murdered, that's not actually what happens.
Right.
And we know that from, as you mentioned, Elliot, a couple of weeks ago in the archaeological record, like there's no reference to that, evidence of that. Right. There's always evidence of violence, but there's no evidence of like clear cutting
the way
huge
it's presented.
section. Right. But it's also in the pages of the Bible. So there are these groups that are like, oh yeah, these people, they actually continue on, and these people continue on. And Israel, Judah are going to be dealing with Canaanites for the rest of the Old Testament. So even though it's like, yeah, they're all wiped out, it was total destruction, it wasn't.
Right.
Yeah. So for example, to point that out, Rick, there are these moments in Joshua where the way it's trying to present it is that this was a very quick, swift, easy victory. They annihilated everyone. They drove them all out. But then even in Joshua 15:63, it says, but the people of Judah could not drive out the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And the Jebusites live with the people of Judah and Jerusalem to this day.
A few verses later, it's the Canaanites. The Canaanites have lived within Ephraim until this day.
In Joshua 13:13, there's also
more Canaanites. And
reference
there's like
of that of folks who
and then before
still lived there together.
Before the episode, I was talking about how it's funny that there's this strand in Joshua that tries to present it as this like clear-cut annihilation, this easy victory. And then you get to the book of Judges, and the book of Judges literally starts by saying, after the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? So it's like,
wait a minute.
Yeah, wait, what? I thought Joshua
they were all gone.
All the Canaanites.
Right,
no.
Not quite.
So one of the things we were talking about before we started was that in the notes about not even just Joshua, but about this whole historical record area, there's a different understanding of history. The piece that I pulled out of all of that text in introducing the books was, the biblical writers are not primarily interested in the accurate recording of real events. Rather, they use these narratives about the past to illustrate various issues of significance to their earliest audience, the ancient Israelite community.
Yeah.
So, they're talking about these big annihilations, and it's not really as though that's actually happening. It's more of a, again, what would it mean for all of these people to be kind of moved out of the way? What does it mean to think of this conquering person coming in and clearing space for the Israelites to live in this area?
Yeah, and maybe just a digression on this view of history. I think, and maybe you're listening and this doesn't bother you at all, but I think for some people, modern folks, they're very bothered. For example, for Rick to say, there's no archaeological evidence that what Joshua presents of a clear and total conquest ever happened. Like, we're talking extra biblical archaeological work in Israel in the ancient Near East that shows like, okay, there is evidence that these people continue to exist from this time to this time to this time. So what Joshua's saying isn't accurate. And I think just a way to maybe talk about history in relationship to scriptures, to Natalie's point, is this view of history reports objective facts exactly as they happened, is very much a modern European view of history that is rooted in the development of universities, of history as a science, of history as kind of scientific retelling of events. And this is not the way ancient people understood history. For ancient people, and this is not even ancient
throughout
Near East.
most of history. Yeah. I mean, this is a modern development, like in what, the 1700s, 16? I mean, it's really not that long ago that we started understanding
Age of Reason
history.
stuff.
Yeah, very much Age of Reason stuff. And and we're not even talking about the way writers of scripture viewed history. I mean, go read Greek history, go read Herodotus. Like, this is how history was told in the ancient world across the board. Like, history was didactic. History was trying to teach you something. It was trying to communicate an ideology of some sort. And so I think that's important to remember for these texts. It's not trying to communicate these events in some sort of scientific manner. It's trying to convey something to the readers. I think it's also worth saying, like, even ancient readers of these scriptures realize that. And this comes into play with like the Gospels, right? Where in the Gospels, like it bothers people that the Gospels have things that quote unquote
don't line up
or contradict. Right. Like, you know, in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus is having, He's having the Last Supper on Passover, but then in the Gospel of John, he's being crucified on Passover. And it's like, that is literally impossible.
Yeah, right.
You know,
yeah.
It's like, these are two different accounts. And even ancient readers were like, they understood that. Yeah. But they were like, this isn't a problem because we don't think of, it's about what's being communicated.
If it was a problem, they would have picked one gospel, and let the other three go.
Right, exactly.
Here's the facts, and here's what we're going to go with. But I always think of particularly the Gospels as a sermon.
Right.
Each one is its own sermon, and it's presenting some details of Jesus's life, passion, death, and resurrection, but it's presenting them from a certain perspective.
Yeah,
because each of the authors wants to say something about. The Deuteronomistic historian is doing the same thing. That they have something to say about what they're presenting as happening to Israel and to Canaan.
I'm so curious. Maybe we can solicit feedback from listeners if this is something that bothers them. Maybe, you know, I'm just curious what the response is. Because I've just found in conversations this does tend to really bother people. It's like, no, I want to know, are they lying? Are they wrong?
Right.
Like, I thought this was, a lot of people just feel like this doesn't, you can't think of this way about Scripture. I'm curious to hear what people think. I think to me, the thing that is it's a very liberating insight, because I'm very glad to know that people were not annihilated. That helps me deal with this text in some regard.
Right.
And I think going back to Rabbi Green from our Exodus episodes, this also helps me remember that this is the perspective of one author or group of authors, right? Like, it doesn't have to be the final say or the final word on this issue.
They're also, the authors are also like wrestling with the theological question of like, how did we get here?
Yeah.
What's our relationship with Canaan and these other people? And one of the perspectives that's thrown in there is like, well, these guys are sacrificing children.
Yeah.
I mean, if there was a country that was like literally sacrificing children, like the UN would go in with a war force to liberate them.
Sure.
Right. And
but they wouldn't kill the kids.
Yeah. Hard to liberate children when you're killing them.
I mean, unless, and it's not historically, that has been a way of liberating people. We have just liberated you from this life that was going to treat you.
Sure.
I mean, horrifying to my modern mind set, but
he's retired now. There was a theologian an ethicist at Duke University, Stanley Hauerwas, great theologian. Look him up. He has some really good works, especially on questions of violence. Talks about Jesus' command to love your neighbor and love your enemy. He says in response to people that are advocating for war, it's really hard to love your neighbor if you kill them. Now, this is a big topic, and there's hundreds of years of theological debate on just war and what constitutes a just war. I think the one thing I will say, Rick, maybe almost in pushback, we can have a little disagreement about the child sacrifice things, and we talked about this before the podcast, is how to contextualize this. When we read Scripture, we've talked about, we all bring our own lenses to Scripture and our own experiences. We do not read these texts as neutral, objective, just dispassionate people. And we were talking before the episode about how the book of Joshua has been deeply troubling to indigenous Christians across the world. And it's been deeply troubling to indigenous Christians across the world because it has been so often in our world that those areas, take, indigenous Native Americans here in North America, have been colonized by Christians who have used these texts and the idea of being God's chosen people to wipe out and annihilate indigenous populations. And oftentimes, as we know historically, this has been done through ideological campaigns of propaganda, of saying these people
they're
sacrifice
lesser.
children. They're evil. They do and we know from history that so often this is
they get scapegoated.
Nothing but propaganda. Like this is not true or accurate. And so it makes Joshua deeply disturbing. And these are indigenous Christian readers of this text who are wrestling with it and wrestling with this dichotomy of like, here is this image of God in Exodus, of a liberating God who rescues people from slavery, who rescues them from oppression, who demands justice, who is trying to create a more egalitarian, just society of love, care for the stranger, care for the alien. And then we get to Joshua, and here's this picture of go into this land and wipe out even children. And and there is no easy answer. And they have been wrestling with this for a long time. And I think the encouragement and the challenge would be, there's an author who's written an article on this. You can look it up. It's free online. Robert Allen Warrior. The article is Canaanites, Indians, and Cowboys, something like that. The order might be different. But his challenge is, what does it look like to read this text from the perspective of the Canaanites? And Rick, one time I'll never forget the sermon. You encouraged the Ignatian practice. And we actually talked about this in a very, very long ago introduction episode of how to read the Bible. And it's putting yourself in the shoes of all the characters. And I think when we read this, it's very rare that we put our shoes in the Canaanite shoes.
Absolutely.
And that's what Robert Allen Warrior encourages Christians today to do if they want to understand what the history of indigenous Christians has been like. And so to put ourselves in that shoes, and that's very hard. I mean, it's hard for me to put myself in those shoes, but if I try my best, I think it's important for us to do as Christians, as people who follow someone that was crucified by the powers that be. What does it look like to read this story from the perspective of the Canaanites, to understand what they experienced, and to see in our world today Canaanites?
Oh,
right.
Like who are the Canaanites today?
Who are the Canaanites today?
Who are Canaanites?
Who are the because look around our world. They certainly have not gone away.
That might be one of the things that the Deuteronomistic historian is wrestling with, because what they say is that what happened to the Canaanites is the same thing that's going to happen to us. Here we're on top, but we're going to be on the bottom. Like the same thing that happens to them is going to happen to us.
Right.
They were in the place of the Canaanite when the Assyrians and the Babylonians came to town.
Right. So
wow.
Yeah. Well, that's why we Christians try to read our scripture from through the lens of Jesus, because Jesus that was not the way that Jesus went about things.
For forces to come along and be like, well, we're going to do this because it was in the book of Joshua, is to completely miss what happens later in the scriptures. It's to miss what happens at the end of the Deuteronomistic history. It
later
completely misses what happens in the New Testament. Jesus could have said to do that to the Romans. He did not.
Yeah, I think this also encourages us to continue to reflect on what does it mean to be the people of God. And I think that's the challenge you're giving with the wider view of these scriptures, that they are all wrestling with this question of what does it look like to be the people of God. Unfortunately, Joshua answers that in a way that is troubling. And there's no getting around that, I don't think. It is troubling, despite what may happen later. But it is important to acknowledge that as it's wrestled with later, it really is flipped quite on its head. Natalie, what are you thinking about? I'm also thinking about Rahab right now.
I was actually also thinking about Rahab, and I was thinking, let's have a little chat about some of the familiar characters people might know from here.
Yeah, Rahab's quite interesting. I mean, so despite everything we've just said, immediately in the book of Joshua, there is a presentation of this enigmatic woman who is a harlot, prostitute, whore, different ways of describing her, and is quite important to this story. And she's a Canaanite and is included in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. And
part of the family of Jesus.
Part of the family of Jesus, and is included in Hebrews, in this passage that is traditionally called the pantheon of faith, or the heroes of faith.
Hebrews 11,
that she is like a hero of faith. I don't know. What do you want to
describe? And then later in the epistle of James also references her. I always find it amazing that James and Hebrews, when they mention her, they specifically say Rahab the prostitute. Like they could have left that out. They could have made a decision like, that's not a word we want to put in the New Testament. We're just going to make her out to be a little prettier, but they don't. They specifically...
Well, I mean, I know we talked about that when we talked about the Gospel of Matthew, that we left in people with spicy backgrounds.
He did not need to put in Rahab into the genealogy. It's a genealogy mostly of men. He just happens to reference 5 women. One of them's a prostitute, Rahab.
Right. Well, yeah.
In Jesus' family tree.
And we said Tamar had the history,
yes,
right?
Right.
You know, she was the one
Ruth,
they all have kind of spicy
Bathsheba,
histories.
right.
Yeah, what's interesting is it's right away, these spies are sent into the city of Jericho to kind of check it out, see what's going on. And they stay at
Rahab's.
what I can only at Rahab's. I'm imagining this is a whorehouse, and maybe they had some choices about where to stay, but that's where they stayed.
Yeah,
there are some notes in here about that they had been settled in Shittim, which was the place where there had been. In previous scripture, the men were laying with the women of Moab, and then the women were bringing in their devoted things, and then they had to all be eliminated. So there's kind of
a spicy place.
So it's a spicy
They're
place.
Coming from a spicy place. They're going to a spicy place.
To a spicy place. And while they're there, the king of Jericho realizes that there's spies in town. So somehow these spies did not do a very good job of spying.
Word gets out. Yep.
Word got out that they're around. Maybe they'd been around for a little bit. We don't know. And so they're trying to find them.
Someone knocks on her door.
Somebody knows to go check out the whorehouse, and she hides the spies because she is aware of Yahweh. And there's some kind of question as to this statement of faith sort of thing going on here. Like, she knows that Yahweh has done all these great things for the Israelites. You're not necessarily clear like how much she's fully on board with being a believer in the Lord, but in this polytheistic society that this would have been, that may not matter terribly.
Yeah, she's not making a claim that would be made later in the Old Testament that Yahweh is the only Lord, but she's making a confession of faith that would have been perfectly fine here, that Yahweh is the best Lord, the greatest,
clearly.
And yeah,
and so because she hides the spies, she negotiates for her salvation when they come to annihilate Jericho
and her family,
and that of her family.
Yeah.
One of the things I was saying earlier is that I imagine that she was not just some random prostitute in this town. I think she must have been the madam. Like, she was probably the person in charge here. She has a lot of agency, and she does some good negotiating of her way out of things, and control of that house too. So that's kind of an interesting thing to kind of consider who else Rahab was.
Yeah.
So, if she had not done this, those spies probably would have been slaughtered. They may not have ever brought any word back. And who knows if this whole Battle of Jericho would have gone the way of the Israelites.
The walls of Jericho may not have come tumbling down.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Again, I had this Old Testament professor, and I loved because she encouraged us that there are really so many different ways you can think about Rahab. And really the 3 major ways you could consider Rahab is the way the New Testament does, which is as this
paragon
figure
of faith
person that helped the Israelites and really did it in a way that she really was a person of faith. Like, when she makes this statement in chapter 2, it's because she really does believe Israel's God. The second is as this woman, and this is kind of to read it through the modern eyes of women and prostitutes, who is cunning and tricky and is doing what it takes to survive, and really not as a person of faith at all. As someone that's like, hey, I heard this is what's happened. I'm going to do what it takes.
And there's other examples of that in the book of Joshua, of people disingenuously saying, oh, we're from a long way away from here. We're not from around here. You don't need to kill us all. And we believe in Yahweh. And
the Gibeonites.
It was all a lie. So, I mean, it would be right in line with them.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the third one, which I think is quite interesting, is that this story is here as a way of explaining why there are still Canaanites in Israel at a later day. This just reminded me that it comes back in chapter 6, right? When they're conquering Jericho. Joshua's there in chapter 6, and Joshua's having the men come and bring Rahab out. chapter 6, around verse 25. And it says, "But Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, Joshua spared. Her family has lived in Israel ever since, for she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out in Jericho." And I used a big word a couple weeks ago, etiology. And etiology in the Old Testament is these moments where it'll say, so this happened, and this still exists in Israel to this day.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's these little narratives that are constructed to basically explain why there are certain ritual practices or ritual sites. And it's kind of an open question of like, which came first, the story or the ritual?
Yeah.
Did the ritual come first and a story was kind of concocted to explain it? Because we often find that in anthropology and archaeology, like these rituals develop and then there's explanations because kids go, well, why do we do this?
Yep.
And so you come up with a story. So there's an interesting way of reading this that kind of says, this is a story that was constructed to explain in a good light why there are Canaanites in Israel. Because when you read Joshua, if you're reading it 200 years later, your question is like, well, Mom and Dad, there's Canaanites right there. What's going on? And it's like, oh, well, Rahab was this prostitute who did, So it almost has this kind of folkloric type telling.
I wonder if it, I like that. It's really interesting. But
Yeah.
I wonder, wouldn't they have cleaned it up a little bit? Like
Maybe.
if it was...
It was this milkmaid.
Right, yes. Yeah,
don't know.
only child and always
Right.
loved the Lord and,
Right. That's a
I
good
don't know.
question.
Is this like not? Did people in ancient times just not need stuff cleaned up for them? Is this like a really modern post-Victorian era thing that we need to have everything sanitized? This is a very unsanitized book.
Yeah. All of the
I
books
will
have
say,
been.
yeah, all of them have been. I will say that this moment that you're referring to here, where Rahab's taken out, was one of the moments where I did imagine being not one of the Israelites, but being Rahab or one of her family members in the midst of all of the slaughter being taken out to safety, like what that would have been like, what you would have heard and seen, and how traumatizing that would have been, even as someone who lived.
Right.
Survivor syndrome or something.
Anyway, and that's so important to do. And we've talked about this in previous referencing previous episodes a lot today. But we've talked quite a bit when we've read the Old Testament, these Hebrew scriptures, of midrash and rabbinic literature, the way Jewish interpreters and rabbis kind of
wrestled with the text,
and I hate to say added to it, but added to it. Like they filled in the gaps. We talked about how
I think it's like illuminating.
Yeah, and one of the things they say is that Rahab married Joshua.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah. I can't speak too much about it. I read this very briefly this morning as I was reading a few things about Joshua preparing, and that was the first time I heard that. But that is one of the kind of midrashic rabbinic traditions, is that Rahab went on to marry Joshua.
Well, you'd think that then his name would have been in the list of
the
descendants instead of hers. But
that's a Christian.
That's true.
Right. That's
not
would be
Jewish.
not
Bunch of Jewish rabbis.
That's interesting.
And I don't even know. Now this is making me actually wonder, how does she end up in the genealogy of Matthew? How does that work?
I know now. I'm not quite sure where that.
I had it up earlier.
Like how
I can't.
How would Matthew have? What's the connection? Interesting. It's verse 5 of Matthew 1, and as it's going, it says, "And Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth."
Maybe when we get further in here to the historical text, we'll Ruth. Maybe it's in the beginning of the book of Ruth.
That's so interesting. So, like, what is the tradition that it's saying about Rahab there? I mean, so it's saying Rahab.
We're stuck on this.
Struggling to understand a genealogy right now. So
it's
when it says
Bible genealogy.
when it says, I'm just pronouncing it salmon because that's how it's spelled.
Right.
And Salmon, the father of Boaz. So Salmon is the father of Boaz by Ruth. So that's saying
Rahab.
Ruth is. Rahab. So that's saying Boaz is Rahab's child.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
So Salmon and Rahab get together and have Boaz.
So there's some tradition that Matthew is drawing on that is saying Rahab is Boaz's mother.
Yep.
And whoever this guy Salmon is, never heard of him.
Yeah.
So that's obviously very different than the rabbinic tradition that says
that Rahab and Joshua got together.
Well, and then that
What-
would make
and what is the-
Rahab King David's great-grandmother.
Right.
Great-great-grandmother.
Right, exactly. Because Boaz, Ruth,
Because in the beginning of Ruth,
you
yeah.
get to David.
Yep.
So, what is even the timeline between Rahab and?
It's Bible timeline.
I know. What is the timeline between Rahab and Ruth?
You know what? I think we should talk about circles around Jericho.
Okay, maybe you need
We
to
will
sing
leave that
about
an open question about
We're
the
giving up.
timeline.
Yeah, answer. A listener can.
If
call
any
in.
listeners has a great, we'll
call
take
in
it.
and let us know.
Anybody with a degree in
Genealogy.
Hebrew scriptures?
Yeah, really. We need above.
Hey, Robert, you out there
Yeah.
still?
We need an
someone
ancestry.com.
We need someone above the MDiv level. We need a true expert. Anyway,
So,
they stomp around Jericho. Many people have heard that.
Yeah, we get a little song.
Really weird guy. He gets stoned. If y'all caught that.
Right, yeah. So they circled around Jericho, and then they gave a great shout, and the walls came tumbling down. And then Achan
steals stuff.
stole
Yeah.
devoted things.
Yes.
So that led first to they were going to go attack A. It's spelled A-I.
I know. Every time I see it, I know.
So they were going to attack A with, only a few guys, and that failed because of Achan's taking the devoted things. And so, thousands of men were slaughtered, and Joshua tore his clothes.
Right. And this is very reminiscent of, probably, we haven't even said this, but important to emphasize, the centrality within Joshua is that Joshua is replacing Moses.
Yeah.
And so really this is
Yes.
a parallelism, if we remember, with Moses at many points in Exodus, on Mount Sinai, in Numbers, as the people are grumbling and complaining, Moses is constantly interceding for the people. And that's what Joshua does here when Achan
He's
sins.
an intermediary figure between the people and
And in fact, I think at one point it literally says there, like Moses.
Which reminds me, there's actually several points before this where God is trying to make it clear to the Israelites that Joshua is the new kind of Moses-ish
Yep.
figure.
Yep.
There's that point at which it's after the Rahab story where Joshua parts the Jordan so
Right.
that they can cross over it.
Right.
Everyone
Obviously,
forgets
it's
that.
like the
Everyone
Red
knows
Sea.
the Red Sea, but everyone forgets the
Right,
Jordan.
but everybody
Parts the
forgets
Jordan,
that Joshua parts
Yep.
the Jordan, thanks to God. And then there's also this raising of a sword that Joshua does that reflects the raising of the staff that Moses does.
So that the victory could happen.
Right.
Yeah. In
One-
addition to.
One last comment about Achan, because that story is so interesting, and parallelism. There is a parallelism of this story in the New Testament in Acts 5. We talked about this off podcast a few weeks back.
It's the stewardship sermon.
It's the stewardship sermon. And go read if you're interested and want just some extra reading, Acts chapter 5. And there's this story of these two Christians in the early church called Ananias and Sapphira. They do some things you're not supposed to do, just like Achan.
Yeah.
Put it bluntly, they die.
Yeah, I mean, they die by an act of God. They just fall over dead.
Yeah.
Here, they're stoned. And I reading the story again, I actually felt bad for Achan because he comes clean.
Yeah.
he does.
He's like, yeah, I did it.
Yeah.
I'm really sorry. And they're like, okay. And they take him, his children, his
his
animals, all of his possessions, and they bury them in a pile of stone. I
Yeah.
mean, it's like, oh.
That sounds so much kinder than what is described. Buried them in a pile of stone.
Right. Not
Well.
the stones that catch on fire. Doesn't it say that?
Stone that came at them pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about that? They are stoned,
Yeah.
and
They are,
and but the pile of stones lasts to this day. I think
Right.
is
Yeah,
how
it does say that.
is how the story
Another
goes.
etiological
Right.
point.
Yep.
Dad, why is there that pile of stones over there?
exactly.
Oh,
Let me tell you
son,
about Achan.
He stole,
There's no
and
archaeological
you
evidence.
shouldn't steal,
Right.
right?
And it was
Yeah.
like the valley of Achor, Achor, the valley of trouble. So then they go off. That's where you get into a lot of defeating of people. The Gibeonites who come in and they dress all like they've been traveling for
very far off,
and pretend that they're from not near neighbors. Oh, we're not your near neighbors. Save us. Give us a promise.
Yeah.
And they do, and then 3 days later, it's always 3 days later,
The ruse is figured out.
the ruse is figured out. And they're like, well, all right, we'll let you live because we swore an oath by God that we would let you live. However, you are now going to be, what was it? It was, they're going to be servants, but it was very specific, like woodcutters and water bearers or something.
Yeah, right.
Was there a particular significance to those particular?
I do not know that.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound good. Like it's probably not a highly sought after job.
Probably not.
Yeah.
Probably
We got
not.
these ditch diggers over here.
Hewers of wood and drawers of water. According to Deuteronomy 29, 10 through 13, the covenant was to erase distinctions between such lower class occupations and others. This designation thus suggests that the Gibeonites are outside the covenantal community. Yeah. Oh, you know what we skipped over? We skipped over all of the foreskins.
How
Can't do that.
We talked about this for 15 minutes before we started rolling the tape.
I think that's why we're not talking about it.
You all did not get to enjoy
and you all can thank us very
Yes.
deeply for not spending 15 minutes on this. But yeah, so there's a
not gonna.
this new generation that has formed in the wilderness was not circumcised. They were not circumcising on the 8th day as they should have been. And so here there's a mass circumcision where everyone is taken care of, and they name the place. So in my version, they translate it as Foreskin Hill.
I mean, literally, that's what it's
that is what it's called.
That's what it's called in my translation as well.
Yeah.
In the footnote. Yeah, I was surprised that they got a pass on doing that this whole time in the wilderness, that they were not, keeping up. This was an Abrahamic covenantal
It's from from
tradition.
Genesis.
Yeah.
Genesis 17.
Right.
Like this has been here for a while.
And really, it doesn't make sense with what's commanded there, because I think it even specifically commands that you're supposed to do it on, like, when the baby is this
The 8th
old.
day.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
the
right, the
8th
8th day.
day.
Like, this is when you do it. And so it's really, like, why didn't this happen
why are we waiting?
in the
Yeah.
wilderness? Yeah.
But you noted, Rick, that the people of the Israelites that came out of Egypt had to do this as well. That there was, that maybe they weren't circumcising in Egypt, or they something.
Yeah, there's a whole thing about, and I can't remember exactly what it is, where they were not
Right.
circumcising in Egypt.
Yeah.
Maybe culturally the rest of the place wasn't, and so they didn't. Or
Right.
at any rate, it was just interesting.
There's a whole
that they
thing
did
about
that 'cause-
Moses didn't circumcise his son, and there's that weird passage in Exodus where God gets really mad at Moses for not having circumcised his son, and it looks like God's going to like smite Moses, and Zipporah, the wife, has to come in and she circumcises. So like there's a whole thing
That's right,
in
that's
these
right.
early books about, yes, we are the people of the covenant, and the sign of the covenant is circumcision, but we don't always quite do it the way we're supposed to.
Yeah. Right.
Well, I also thought it was interesting. So they do that after they've crossed the Jordan, but then they take a little break, because you're going to need a break after that.
Gonna need a little break.
And then they celebrate the Passover, and then the manna stops coming. And I had forgotten that these people had been subsisting off of manna all of this time. It
Yep.
just had completely left my line of thinking until they talk about where now there's no longer any manna because they're able to eat the fruit of the land that they're in.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But I also wondered, okay, so here they are. They've crossed the Jordan. Everybody knows they're coming.
Everybody knows
Everybody
they're coming.
knows they're coming. They've crossed the Jordan. Now they're all vulnerable and hanging out for a few days to heal and celebrating a festival to the Lord. And nobody comes to attack them in any of this time.
I know.
It's, one of those doesn't make a lot of sense.
It reminds me of that story from Genesis, after the rape of Dinah. The guy who takes her in is like, "Oh, I'll marry her," and the family's like, "Okay, you can marry her, but you and your whole town have to be circumcised,
Yeah.
in order."
Yeah.
And so they all get circumcised, and then the sons of Jacob
Kill
go
them.
in and kill them all
Yeah.
because the men can't do anything because they're in such pain.
Right.
So
they're recovering.
So
Yeah.
in Genesis presents that as a vulnerable time. And
Right.
here in the book of Joshua, it's a vulnerable time, but no one took advantage of that vulnerability
Yeah, yeah.
for whatever reason.
Yeah,
Just-
that's a great correlation. I do think about. I'm just so curious what women reading these Old Testament texts, if they've thought about it. Maybe not, because maybe they're just thinking of these as ancient texts. But the fact that this is the central ritual of the covenant
And
ritual,
only for men.
and it's only for men.
Yeah.
And what does that say? And I was actually saying I would love personally to read more about that and reflect on that. And Rick, you made a great point of, I think oftentimes as Christians, we don't really think about it. And later Jewish traditions have thought about this as well, and they've understood it in different ways. Yeah, I feel like that would really bother me if I was reading this as a woman. Natalie, you had said you didn't think too much about it. Like
no, I hadn't. And now that you've brought it up today, now I want to kind of think about that a little bit more, because I've always just seen it as this painful ritual that the men had to go through. And oftentimes in scripture, it's not just happening to babies who like can feel that pain, but they're not remembering it.
Yeah.
It's happening sometimes to adult men.
Yeah.
And that just sounds, I mean, it's horrific. Because it sounds so painful and uncomfortable and very unappealing.
You're good.
You're not jealous.
You're good. Right.
I'm not fixating too much on how, like, really, that kind of takes up the space that would otherwise be thinking, well, now, wait a minute. There's not a female equivalent to this. And thank God there's not a female equivalent to this.
Of course.
Yeah.
Because female circumcision, that's like,
Right.
that's a whole other thing.
Right.
Because I'm so focused on what the pain and whatnot of that would be, I'm not thinking so much about the covenant relationship thing. But surely some other women who are deep scripture readers have thought about this, probably at least in Jewish tradition.
Yeah. So I just looked it up because I mean,
of course, you're going to just Google it right now and find the answer.
I had to, because this truly is not something I've reflected much on or read much about. I will fully admit this is a gap in my reading. And at least just a very cursory search is saying this has bothered some modern women readers as representing very much a male-centric kind of covenantal model, reflective of a patriarchal society. But in terms of Jewish interpretations, one rabbinic tradition has suggested that, I kind of like this one, circumcision was not required because women's bodies were already complete in a way that does not require an additional sign. The Talmud... I can't say I read the Talmud too much, but in Kedushin 29a discusses how women are not obligated in circumcision-related commandments, and some later commentators argue that women's bodies are already complete and they participate with alternative signs of inclusion. So some argue that participation in commandments such as Sabbath observance or ritual purity laws serve as parallel signs of covenant membership.
Interesting.
Others highlight that rituals like the mikvah, ritual
the bathing.
Yeah, the bathing plays a role in their religious identity.
Well, and the other thing is that was a covenant that had to do, that goes back to the becoming the father of these nations and the many. And the men can't do that without the women.
Right.
So the childbirth is part of that covenantal, like that actually taking place. Yeah. And I don't want to draw comparisons, but childbirth is not a comfortable thing to go through.
Right.
And in these times, I mean, even today, it is extremely dangerous at any moment from conception to post-delivery. I mean, post-delivery, a woman could die from fulfilling the covenant of all of these children being born.
Of being fruitful and multiplying.
Of being fruitful and multiplying. Whereas that same bodily risk does not apply to men. At all.
Right.
So in some ways, the childbirth is the fulfillment of the covenant for women.
Yes, and it's funny you say that because scholars have made that point and made that argument, and Jewish interpreters have said similar things. So
wow, it only took me like 3 minutes to come up with that.
You might have a role in researching this topic and writing about it more.
Well, we're going to have plenty of time to talk about this more because it's going to show up again and again. And even in the New Testament, you might think this, it's one of those like strange things from the Old Testament. No. The New Testament is filled with discussion on this because one of the central issues that the early church has to wrestle with is, do Gentile Christians have to first become Jewish before they can become Christian? Do they have to be circumcised? Do they have to keep kosher? And we see people wrestling with this in the book of Acts, but also Paul is wrestling with it in his letter to the Galatians.
Yeah.
And so
what you're saying is we're going to do an entire bonus episode on circumcision.
With parental advisories.
With an explicit E in the title. Oh, man. I'm getting carried away.
All right,
Can I just say the second half of Joshua is one of the most dreadfully boring things I've ever read. I just need to say
it's up there with
that.
certain parts of Numbers.
I think I hands down think the second half of Joshua was infinitely worse than Leviticus, Numbers, anything in Deuteronomy. I mean, it's chapters after chapters of, and then they gave this land and this land and this land, and it's just allotment.
You should see my notes for a whole chapter. More defeating and burning.
Yeah.
That was chapter 11. Chapters 15 through 17.
Yes, 15
allotments.
yeah.
That's
Horrible.
all I wrote about those.
Horrible.
So, yeah, there's a lot of, they're dividing up the land. It's really boring. Yeah. Some people didn't get driven out. Okay. They're surveying the land for the Levites and where are the Levites' cities going to be. Great. The cities of refuge. I was a little confused as to whether, at that point, I was just kind of listening for anything that sounded like it might be interesting. And I thought they indicated that Galilee was a city of refuge, but Galilee is a region, not a city, right?
Yeah, it is.
So
around the sea.
I think I misheard that.
In general, the cities of refuge were interesting. It definitely paralleled things in Leviticus about these attempts to create a more lenient and just society.
Every time I see it, though, I just keep thinking, like, how many times are people mistakenly getting killed? If we have to set up city after city after city for people who mistakenly kill somebody else, like, this must have been happening an awful lot.
Yeah.
Like, this is a problem that needs a solution.
Yeah.
Wow.
Apparently.
Like, okay, so I'm thinking for a minute, like, what might be the ways where you accidentally kill somebody? Like, we're talking about ancient times. You don't have the same safety protocols.
There's no
you
OSHA.
Have.
There's
no
no
OSHA.
right.
There could have been farming accidents.
Yeah, sure.
Or, the food sources. What if somebody, fed somebody something and it wasn't cooked all the way and they accidentally died of...
Right.
It just shows you how precarious life is in this time. And it's another, I think, way to, like, just look at the violence of this entire book, that life was precarious and scary.
Yeah.
Yes. It's something I thought about. I was having a conversation with someone the other day, and we were talking about how systemically we set societies up in a way that the very structure of the society is such that there will be death and accidents. And to make this concrete, the example they gave is, we have decided as a society, we are going to drive in cars and we are going to have roads and interstates. Yeah. And it is by that very fact,
there are going to be accidents.
Unavoidable that in this country, 46,000 people die every single year.
Did you just Google that?
Well, they told me this, and then I double-checked, because I remember thinking, like,
wow,
that is insanely high.
Wow.
Every single year, 46,000 people die of car accidents. And it's just the way society is structured. It is, to some extent, unavoidable. And I'm bringing this up because it reminds me of your joke about these cities of refuge. Like, how many people were accidentally killing people? Well, if the analogy of car deaths is a good example, maybe more than you might think.
How many people walk away from a car accident? That's terrible. Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, a lot of gun deaths are accidental too.
Yeah. What was the cars for this time, right? And we were joking farming deaths or whatever.
But then to have that, like, we have a city of refuge. We're going to have a place of forgiveness and grace. That like life isn't over.
Right.
We've wrestled with, like, where's the heart in this passage? Like here's a place where there's some heart.
Right. They're attempting to deal with this
in a compassionate way.
Right.
This terrible thing has happened.
Right.
Someone's life has ended, but yours hasn't.
Right.
And you can live over here.
Right. Yeah. Oh man.
Yeah.
Makes me think of your forgiveness for him, Rick. Yeah, it makes me think about that.
So speaking of heart things, one of the things that struck me is at the end of chapter 21, there's this passage about the Lord giving everything that had been promised. This is 21:43 through 45. Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to their ancestors that he would give them. And having taken possession of it, they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. And there's just that beautiful reminding of God keeping God's promises.
This promise that started with Abraham for us months ago on this journey has, like,
it's been fulfilled.
Done.
Yeah.
It was beautiful.
On to the next.
On to the next.
before we go on to the next, a few tiny things at the end happen here. A long time afterward, according to chapter 23, Joshua is preparing for his death. And at the end of the book of Joshua, we have Joshua's death with no specific successor named,
Yep.
which I noticed,
Yeah.
which was different from when Moses died.
That's going to be a problem.
Yep.
Right? So no particular successor named when Joshua dies. The bones of Joseph. The bones of Joseph carried out of Egypt
Talk
are
about
finally interred.
Another callback from Genesis.
Yeah, another callback from Genesis. And I read that they interred them in Shechem and then Shechem, maybe? I'm not sure. Shechem. And then I looked on one of my handy Bible maps, and it turns out that Shechem, the city, is right on the border of land allotted to Manasseh and land allotted to Ephraim, who are the two half-tribes, the sons of Joseph. So it's kind of nice that he's
planted
interred,
in the middle.
Right,
Yep.
planted in the middle of them. And then Eleazar dies. So the chief priest is now also. So now we come to the end of Joshua.
So who's going to be the leader now?
Yeah.
We don't know. Now,
That's just the
probably
whole-
Phineas was Eleazar's son, so maybe, but no obvious successor is named here at the end of Joshua,
So
which is a
this is a
shift.
This is a transition. It's a shift to a whole new way of organizing ourselves,
Yeah.
and we'll see how it goes.
We'll see.
Well, that's it. That's the end of Joshua. Quite literally, the end of Joshua.
The end.
And we move on to the judges.
All right. We got this.
So, what do?
Gird your loins.
Oh, man. I don't know.
Thanks for joining us, folks. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cross Connections Cover to Cover. New episodes drop each Wednesday. Please be sure to follow or like us on your favorite podcasting app to find us easily each week, or join us on our email list at stdavidschurch.org/crossconnections. If you have questions for us, you can call us at 484-588-5656 and leave a voicemail with your name, where you're from, and your question or comment. Please note, we may use your recorded voice in an upcoming episode of Cross Connections. If you like what you hear, we'd love if you would share this with your friends and rate us in Spotify and Apple Podcasts or whatever other app you're using so people can find us as well. Don't forget to visit our show notes for the year's reading list and any other resource links we've mentioned. Cross Connections is a ministry of St. David's Episcopal Church in Wayne, Pennsylvania. Season 2 Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley.
Elliot Van Hoy.
and Natalie Hill. Logo graphic design and podcast production by Natalie Hill. Stock media music provided by Marscott and Mood Mode Pond 5. You're welcome to learn more about all of St. David's worship and ministries at stdavidschurch.org.